The great hall of Moonfall Kingdom had never been this silent. Hundreds of wolves stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the carved stone arches, and not one of them dared to breathe too loudly. Elena Voss stood alone in the center of the marble floor, her hands folded in front of her, her spine straight, her chin lifted. She had worn her best dress that night, a deep blue gown that matched the color of the moon pool outside the palace walls. She had curled her hair. She had practiced her smile in the mirror for an hour. None of it mattered now. Alpha King Damien Ashford stood on the raised platform above her, dressed in black and silver, his eyes the color of storm clouds. He was the strongest alpha the kingdom had seen in 3 generations, a man whose voice alone could quiet a room, whose presence made lesser wolves lower their gazes without being told. Elena had loved him since she was 16 years old. Tonight she was 22, and she had believed, truly believed, that he loved her back. The ceremony was supposed to be simple. The Alpha King would name his mate before the kingdom, seal the bond with the traditional words, and the celebration would begin. Elena had been told 2 days earlier that this was the night. She had not slept since. She had imagined every detail, the way his hand would find hers, the way the crowd would cheer, the way her mother would cry happy tears in the front row. Her mother was not crying happy tears. Her mother, Corinne Voss, stood near the platform steps in a gown of deep red, and there was something in her expression that Elena had never seen before. Not pride, not joy, something closer to hunger. Damien raised his hand, and the hall fell into an even deeper silence, the kind of silence that presses against the ears. "Tonight," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall without effort, "I stand before my kingdom, to name the woman who will rule beside me as Luna." Elena's heart pounded so hard she was certain the wolves nearest her could hear it. She took a small step forward, the way they had rehearsed, the way tradition demanded. She lifted her eyes to meet his. Damien did not look at her. "Elena Voss," he said, and for one impossible second, hope surged through her chest, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Then his next words landed like ice water. "I reject you as my fated mate." The words did not make sense at first. Elena's mind simply refused to accept them, the way a hand refuses to believe it has touched fire, until the pain arrives a half-second later. She stood frozen, her lips slightly parted, waiting for him to laugh, to say it was some strange test, to take it back. He did not take it back. Gasps rippled through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Somewhere behind her, a woman whispered something to her neighbor, too shocked to keep her voice down. Elena felt every eye in the hall turn to her, felt the weight of hundreds of stares pressing into her skin, and still she could not move. "The bond between us was never right," Damien continued, and now his eyes did meet hers, but there was no warmth in them, no apology, nothing that resembled the man she had known. "I have felt it weakening for months. A true Luna must be chosen with certainty, not obligation." Obligation. The word hit her harder than the rejection itself, as if the nights they had spent together meant nothing, as if the promises whispered in the dark under the old oak tree by the river had been nothing but a temporary arrangement he now regretted. Elena wanted to scream. She wanted to ask him how he could stand there and lie to an entire kingdom, how he could pretend that what had grown between them over the last year had been some kind of mistake. She wanted to tell him the truth, the secret pressed so carefully beneath her ribs, the one thing that would silence this entire room and bring him to his knees. She said nothing, because the moment she opened her mouth, everyone would know, and the moment they knew, her child would become a prize to be fought over, a claim to be used, a weapon in whatever game Damien was playing. She had seen enough of pack politics to understand that. A secret revealed in anger was a secret lost forever. So Elena Voss stood in the center of that vast hall, humiliated in front of everyone who had ever known her name, and she said nothing at all. Damien turned from her. That was the part that would stay with her longest, longer than the words, longer than the gasps. He simply turned away, as though she had already ceased to exist, and he lifted his hand toward the platform steps. "Corinne Voss," he said. The hall went silent again, but this silence was different. This one had an edge to it, sharp and uncertain, because everyone understood what those two names spoken together meant, and none of them could quite believe it. Elena's own mother stepped forward. Corinne moved with the grace of a woman who had rehearsed this moment far more carefully, than her daughter had rehearsed the one she believed was coming. She climbed the platform steps slowly, her red gown trailing behind her like a wound spreading across white marble. When she reached Damien's side, she turned to face the crowd, and for the briefest instant, her eyes found Elena's. There was no apology in that look either. There was something closer to triumph. "I name Corinne Voss as Luna of Moonfall Kingdom," Damien announced, and his hand closed around her mother's wrist, the traditional gesture that sealed a Luna's place beside her king. The crowd did not know how to respond. A few scattered wolves began to clap, uncertain, glancing sideways at their neighbors for permission. The applause grew, hesitant at first, then louder, because that was what one did when the Alpha King made a declaration, whether or not it made any sense. Elena stood alone on the floor below the platform, watching her mother accept a crown that should have been offered to her, watching the man she loved hold her mother's hand, in the exact way he had once held hers under the stars. The room spun slightly. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach, hidden beneath the folds of her blue gown, and she thought of the small, fragile life growing there, the one detail in this entire catastrophe that Damien Ashford did not know. She thought, with a strange and sudden clarity, that this was the only power she had left in this room. Everyone here believed they knew the full truth of what had just happened. Only she knew there was more to the story, a piece hidden so deep that even the Alpha King himself, with all his strength and all his instincts, had somehow missed it entirely. The music began. Someone had cued the celebration musicians far too early, and the sound of stringed instruments filled the hall in jarring contrast to the tension still hanging in the air. Wolves began to move, some toward the platform to offer congratulations to the new Luna, others toward the doors, uncertain whether they were meant to stay or go. Elena remained still in the center of it all, a stone in a river of motion. A hand touched her elbow. She turned to find her childhood friend, Nora Blake, standing beside her, concern written plainly across her face. "Elena," Nora whispered. "Come with me, please. You don't have to stand here." Elena let herself be pulled toward the side of the hall, away from the crush of wolves moving toward the platform. Her legs felt distant, as though they belonged to someone else, someone being steered by strings. Nora guided her through a side door into a narrow stone corridor, where the music grew muffled and the air felt cooler. "What just happened in there?" Nora said, once the door had closed behind them. "I don't understand it. You two were everything. Everyone could see it." "How could he do that? And to choose your own mother, Elena. That's not just cruel. That's—" Nora did not finish the sentence, because there were no words large enough to hold what had just happened. Elena leaned back against the cold stone wall and closed her eyes. She could still hear the faint sound of applause drifting through the door, could still picture her mother's face glowing with the crown she had just accepted. "I need to go home," Elena said quietly. "I'll walk with you." "No." Elena opened her eyes. "I need to be alone, Nora. Please. I just need to think." Nora hesitated, clearly wanting to argue, but something in Elena's expression must have convinced her otherwise. She nodded slowly and stepped back. "If you need anything tonight, anything at all, you send for me. I mean it." Elena managed a small nod, and Nora slipped back through the door into the noise of the celebration, leaving her alone in the quiet corridor. For a long moment, Elena simply stood there, breathing. She pressed both hands flat against the stone wall behind her, and let its coldness ground her. Let it remind her that she was still standing, still whole, still capable of thought, despite everything that had just been taken from her. She thought of the night 3 months ago when she had first suspected. She had been standing in the palace gardens at dawn, when the scent of the roses had turned her stomach in a way it never had before. She had dismissed it as nerves, as the stress of the upcoming ceremony everyone assumed was coming. It was Agnes Hart, the palace healer, who had confirmed it 2 weeks later, her weathered hands gentle, as she examined Elena in the small healing chamber, tucked behind the eastern wing. "You're carrying a pup," Agnes had said, her voice careful, watching Elena's face for a reaction. "Early yet. 2 months along, perhaps a little more." Elena remembered the way joy and terror had crashed into her at the same moment, indistinguishable from one another. She had planned to tell Damien that very week, had chosen the words carefully, had imagined his face lighting with the same joy she felt. She had never gotten the chance. 2 days after Agnes confirmed the pregnancy, Damien had told her the ceremony was moving forward, that the ancient traditions demanded he name his mate before the full moon reached its peak. Elena had assumed, foolishly, gloriously, that the ceremony would be for her. She had decided to tell him the secret that very night, after the crowd had gone, when it would be just the two of them beneath the stars. Now she understood how wrong she had been. A sound in the corridor pulled her from her thoughts, footsteps approaching from the direction of the hall. Elena straightened instinctively, wiping any trace of emotion from her face, before whoever it was could see it. She had learned that skill young, growing up as the daughter of a beta who had fallen from favor, learning early that showing weakness in Moonfall Kingdom was an invitation for others to take advantage. It was not Nora who rounded the corner. It was Corinne. Her mother had left the celebration, still wearing her red gown, the golden circlet of the Luna already resting on her dark hair. She looked younger than Elena remembered, lit by some inner fire that had not been there before tonight. "Elena," Corinne said, and there was no shame in her voice, no hesitation. "We should talk." "About what, Mother?" Elena's voice came out flatter than she intended, but she did not try to soften it. "About how you accepted a crown from the man who just humiliated me in front of the entire kingdom." Corinne's expression tightened, just slightly. "You don't understand the position I was placed in tonight. You had a choice." "Did I?" Corinne stepped closer, lowering her voice. "When the Alpha King asks you to stand beside him, you do not refuse. Not unless you want to make an enemy of the most powerful wolf in the kingdom. I did what was necessary to protect this family." "Protect this family," Elena repeated, a bitter edge creeping into her voice. "By taking my place?" "Your place was already gone the moment he spoke those words," Corinne said. "Nothing I did or did not do would have changed that. I simply made sure that someone from our bloodline still held influence in this palace, rather than letting some stranger take the crown instead." Elena studied her mother's face, searching for even a flicker of guilt, of regret, of anything resembling love. She found none. She thought of all the years growing up in her mother's shadow, always slightly too quiet, always slightly too careful, always aware that her mother's ambitions ran deeper than most people realized. "You knew," Elena said slowly, a terrible understanding dawning. "You knew before tonight. This wasn't a surprise to you." Corinne's silence was answer enough. "How long?" Elena whispered. "How long have you known he was going to reject me?" "A week," Corinne admitted, and for the first time, something like discomfort passed across her features. "He came to me privately. He said the bond had never felt complete, that he sensed something was missing between the two of you. He asked for my counsel." "Your counsel." Elena felt sick, and instead of telling me, instead of warning your own daughter, you spent that week making yourself useful to him. "I did what needed to be done. You betrayed me." "I survived," Corinne said, her voice sharpening now, defensive. "The same way I have survived every difficult moment in this kingdom, since your father died and left us with nothing but debts and a ruined name. You think I enjoyed watching you stand in that hall tonight? You think this was easy for me?" "I think," Elena said, her voice trembling now, though whether from grief or fury she could not say, "that you cared more about the crown than you ever cared about me." Corinne's jaw tightened. For a moment, Elena thought her mother might actually respond honestly, might actually admit to the truth sitting plainly between them. Instead, Corinne straightened her spine, adjusted the circlet on her head, and stepped back. "You will need somewhere to stay," Corinne said, her voice cool again, businesslike. "I assume you cannot remain in the guest quarters near the royal wing any longer. I will have someone arrange rooms for you in the outer residences. I don't need your help." "Elena, be reasonable. Where else will you go?" Elena looked at her mother for a long moment, at the crown resting on her head, at the red gown that had replaced the blue one Elena had chosen so carefully, for a night that was supposed to belong to her. She thought of the secret pressed beneath her ribs, the one truth in this entire kingdom that her mother did not know, that Damien did not know, that no one but Agnes Hart and Elena herself knew. "I'll figure it out," Elena said quietly. She turned and walked away before her mother could respond, her footsteps echoing against the stone corridor, carrying her away from the sound of celebration music, still drifting faintly from the great hall behind her. Outside, the night air was sharp and cold, and the full moon hung low over the palace grounds, indifferent to everything that had just happened beneath its light. Elena walked without any real direction, her mind replaying the ceremony over and over, the words, the silence, the way Damien had turned from her, as though she had never mattered at all. She found herself eventually at the edge of the palace gardens, near the old stone bench where she used to sit as a child, while her father worked in the beta's quarters nearby. She sat down slowly, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold, and for the first time since the ceremony began, she allowed herself to cry. The tears came in silence, no sobbing, no sound at all, just a steady stream down her face, that she did not bother to wipe away. She cried for the humiliation, for the betrayal, for the mother, who had chosen ambition over her own daughter. But mostly, she realized as the tears slowed, she cried for the child she carried, a child who would grow up knowing none of this, a child whose existence would either save her or destroy whatever remained of her life in this kingdom. She placed her hand over her stomach again, feeling nothing yet but the promise of what was to come, and she made herself a quiet, private vow. Whatever happened next, whatever Damien Ashford and her mother had planned for the future of Moonfall Kingdom, they would build it, without knowing the one thing that could change everything. Elena would carry her secret exactly the way she had carried it tonight, silently, carefully, until the moment came when revealing it would serve her, rather than destroy her. She did not know yet what that moment would look like, or when it would arrive, or whether she would even still be in this kingdom when it did. But sitting alone in the cold garden beneath the indifferent moon, Elena Voss made a decision that would shape everything that followed. She would not beg. She would not fight for a place that had already been stripped from her in front of hundreds of witnesses. She would not stay in a kingdom where her own mother wore the crown that should have been hers, where the man she had loved looked through her as though she were made of glass. She would leave, quietly, carefully, without a scene, without giving either of them the satisfaction of watching her fall apart any further than she already had tonight. And she would take her secret with her, into whatever life waited beyond the borders of Moonfall Kingdom, safe from the ambitions of a mother who had chosen power over love, and safe from a king who had chosen to reject the one truth that might have changed everything had he only known to ask. The moon climbed higher above the trees. Somewhere behind her, the celebration continued, oblivious to the quiet resolve settling over the woman sitting alone in the garden, planning the first steps of a departure that no one in that glittering hall would see coming until it was already far too late to stop her. 3 months earlier, Elena had stood in the exact same garden, waiting for Damien beneath the old oak tree, her heart racing, with a different kind of fear entirely. She remembered the way the summer air had smelled that night, warm and full of jasmine, the way the crickets had gone quiet the moment his footsteps approached from the direction of the training grounds. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say 100 times that day, pacing the length of her small room until the words felt natural on her tongue. "I need to tell you something," she had planned to say, and then the rest would follow, simple and true. She was carrying his child. Their child. A future neither of them had dared to speak aloud yet, but one that felt, in that golden summer evening, entirely possible. Damien had arrived exactly on time, as he always did, his broad shoulders relaxed, his gray eyes soft, in a way they rarely were when others were watching. He had kissed her forehead before she could even open her mouth, and something about the tenderness of that gesture had made her lose her nerve entirely. "You look like you have something on your mind," he had said, studying her face with the same sharp attention he gave to matters of pack strategy. "It's nothing," she had answered, and she had told herself she would find a better moment, a calmer moment, a moment when the words would come easier. She had not known, standing beneath that oak tree, that the better moment she was waiting for would never arrive. She had not known that within weeks, everything between them would shift in ways she could not have predicted, and the secret she was protecting so carefully would become the only thing standing between her and complete ruin. Now, sitting in her small room in the outer residences 3 months later, the morning after the ceremony that had ended everything, Elena understood with painful clarity how much time she had wasted waiting for a moment that had never been coming. She had not slept. The room around her was sparse, nothing like the comfortable guest quarters she had occupied near the royal wing for the past year. This was a servant's room, small and plain, with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out over the kitchen gardens instead of the moon pool. Corinne had arranged it, true to her word, though Elena suspected her mother had chosen this particular room deliberately, a subtle reminder of exactly how far Elena's status had fallen in a single evening. A knock sounded at her door, soft and hesitant. Elena rose slowly from the edge of the bed, smoothing the wrinkles from the plain gray dress she had changed into, after finally leaving the garden the night before. She opened the door to find Agnes Hart standing in the narrow hallway, a woven basket balanced on one hip. "I heard what happened," Agnes said quietly, stepping inside once Elena waved her in. "The whole kingdom has heard by now, I imagine." "I imagine so." Elena closed the door behind them, grateful for the privacy. "Did you bring something for me, or did you simply come to see how I was holding up?" "Both." Agnes set the basket on the small table near the window, and began removing items: dried herbs, a small jar of something pale and waxy, a folded cloth. "You need to keep your strength up. Whatever happens next, that child still needs you healthy and fed." Elena watched the older woman work, grateful beyond words for the quiet competence in her movements, the lack of pity in her expression. Agnes had delivered nearly every pup born in the kingdom for the last 30 years. She had seen every kind of family situation imaginable, and if she had opinions about the mess Elena now found herself in, she kept them carefully hidden. "Have you told anyone?" Elena asked, though she already trusted the answer. "Not a soul, and I don't intend to." Agnes glanced up, her weathered face serious. "But Elena, you need to think carefully about what you plan to do. A secret like this doesn't stay buried forever. Not in a place like this. Someone will notice eventually. The changes in your body, the scent, all of it. Wolves have sharp senses, and this palace is full of wolves who would very much like to know anything that might give them influence over the new Luna's daughter." Elena sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, pressing her palms against her eyes. "I don't know what to do, Agnes. Last night I told myself I would stay quiet, that I would find some way to protect this secret and figure everything out as I went. But you're right. I can't hide something like this forever, not here." "Then perhaps," Agnes said carefully, setting down the jar she had been holding, "the answer is not to hide it here at all." Elena lowered her hands and looked up at her. "There's nothing left for you in this kingdom," Agnes continued, her voice gentle but direct. "Your place beside the Alpha King is gone. Your mother has taken the position you once believed would be yours. Every wolf in this palace watched you rejected in front of the entire court. What future do you imagine for yourself here, Elena? And what future do you imagine for a child born into that same shadow?" The words landed with quiet, undeniable weight. Elena had spent the night circling the same fear, without ever naming it so plainly. But hearing Agnes say it aloud made the truth impossible to avoid any longer. "You're saying I should leave. I'm saying you should consider it." Agnes sat down beside her on the narrow bed, her voice dropping lower, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "You are young. You are capable. You have skills that would serve you well anywhere, not just within these palace walls. If you stay here, your child will grow up known only as the daughter of a rejected mate, and a mother who chose her own ambitions over her family. That is not a life I would wish on any child." Elena thought of Cade, though she had not yet chosen that name, thought of the small life growing inside her, who deserved better than a childhood spent as a whispered scandal in the halls of Moonfall Kingdom. She thought of Damien's cold eyes the night before, the way he had turned from her without a flicker of hesitation. She thought of her mother's crown, gleaming under the candlelight, chosen over her own daughter's happiness. "Where would I even go?" Elena asked, though the question felt less like a refusal, and more like the beginning of a plan. "There are border towns beyond the northern hills," Agnes said, "places where wolves and humans live side by side, where no one asks too many questions about where you came from, or why. I have a cousin who settled in one such town years ago. I could write you a letter of introduction, tell them you are skilled with herbs and healing, which is no lie. You would have a chance to build something new there, away from all of this." Elena sat quietly for a long moment, turning the idea over in her mind. Leaving meant giving up everything familiar, every friend, every memory, of the life she had known since childhood. It meant walking away without ever confronting Damien with the truth, without ever forcing her mother to see the consequences of her choices. But staying meant something far worse. Staying meant raising her child in the shadow of a rejection that would follow them both for the rest of their lives. Staying meant watching her mother rule beside the man who had broken her heart, watching from the edges of a court that would never again treat her as anything other than a cautionary tale. "I need to think," Elena said finally. "Of course." Agnes rose from the bed and gathered the empty basket. "But Elena, don't think for too long. The longer you wait, the harder this decision becomes to make, and the more visible your condition will grow. If you decide to go, it needs to happen soon, while you can still travel safely, and while your secret is still yours alone to keep." After Agnes left, Elena remained in her small room for the rest of the morning, staring out the narrow window at the kitchen gardens below. She watched the palace staff move through their daily routines, unaware or unbothered by the scandal that had rocked the great hall the night before. Life continued, indifferent to her heartbreak, and something about that indifference steadied her more than any comfort could have. By midday, hunger finally drove her from the room, and she made her way toward the kitchens, keeping her head down, avoiding the curious glances of the servants she passed along the way. She had nearly reached the kitchen entrance when a familiar voice called her name from across the courtyard. "Elena." She turned to find Nora hurrying toward her, worry etched across her face. "I've been looking for you all morning. You disappeared last night without a word. I needed to be alone. I understand that. But Elena, you can't just vanish. Not after what happened. People are talking, and some of the things being said." Nora hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was close enough to overhear. "Some of them are not kind. I imagine they wouldn't be." Nora studied her friend's face carefully. "You seem different this morning. Calmer than I expected." Elena managed a small, tired smile. "I spent most of the night crying, if that's what you're asking. But somewhere around dawn I stopped, because crying wasn't going to change anything that happened, and it certainly isn't going to fix what comes next." "What does come next?" Elena glanced around the courtyard, at the palace walls rising high above them, at the guards stationed near the gates, at the entire world she had known since birth. She thought of Agnes's words, of the border towns beyond the northern hills, of the child growing inside her, who deserved a chance at a life untouched by scandal. "I don't know yet," Elena said, though the lie felt smaller than it should have. "But I'm not staying here to be pitied by the entire kingdom, Nora. I refuse to spend the rest of my life as the woman the Alpha King rejected." "So, what will you do? Fight for your place back? Demand answers from him?" "No." Elena's voice was quiet but firm. "I'm done fighting for a place that was never mine to begin with. Not really. I think it's time I found something that actually belongs to me." Nora's brow furrowed with confusion, clearly sensing there was more beneath her friend's words than she was being told, but she did not push further. "Whatever you decide, Elena, I'm here. You know that." "I know." Elena squeezed her friend's hand gently. "And I'm grateful for it, more than you realize. But this is something I need to work through on my own for now." They parted ways at the kitchen entrance, Nora heading back toward the servants' quarters where she worked, Elena continuing inside to find something to eat. As she sat alone at a small wooden table near the back of the kitchen, picking at a bowl of stew the cook had offered without comment, Elena's mind kept returning to the same image, over and over. Damien's face, cold and distant, as he spoke the words that ended everything between them. Her mother's face, glowing with quiet triumph as she accepted the crown that should have belonged to her own daughter. The two of them standing together on that platform, hand in hand, while Elena stood alone below them, carrying a secret neither of them would ever suspect. By the time evening fell, Elena had made her decision. She found Agnes in the healing chambers just after sunset, mixing tinctures by candlelight, and the older woman looked up the moment Elena stepped through the door, reading the answer in her expression before a single word was spoken. "You've decided," Agnes said. "I have." Elena closed the door behind her, her voice steady, despite the enormity of what she was about to say. "Write your letter. I'm leaving Moonfall Kingdom, and I'm not looking back." Agnes nodded slowly, setting down the small glass vial she had been holding. "Then we don't have much time to prepare. You'll need supplies, coin if you can gather any without drawing attention, and a plan for how to leave without anyone noticing until you're already gone." "I have an idea about that," Elena said, thinking of the old smuggler trails her father had shown her as a child, the narrow paths through the northern hills that avoided the main roads, and the watchful eyes of the palace guards. My father used to take me along the border paths when I was young, before he lost his position here. I know ways out of this kingdom that most wolves have long forgotten. Then it seems, Agnes said, a faint smile touching her weathered face for the first time since she had arrived, that your father left you something valuable after all, even if he never lived to see how you would use it. Elena thought of her father then, gone for nearly 6 years now, a beta who had fallen from grace, through circumstances Elena had never fully understood, whose death had left her mother scrambling for status and security, in ways that had clearly shaped every choice Corinne had made since. She wondered, not for the first time, whether her mother's willingness to accept Damien's crown the night before had been born from genuine ambition, or from a deeper fear of poverty and powerlessness that had haunted her since her husband's death. It did not matter now. Whatever her mother's reasons, the choice had been made, and Elena would not spend another moment waiting for an apology that would never come. "I'll need a few days," Elena said, her mind already working through the details. "Time to gather what I need, without drawing suspicion. Time to make sure I understand the trails well enough to travel them safely." "Take the time you need," Agnes said. "But Elena, once you decide to go quickly, and go quietly. The moment anyone in this palace suspects what you're carrying, the moment they realize the danger and the opportunity that child represents, your chance to leave freely will disappear." Elena nodded, understanding the weight of the warning fully. She thought of the days ahead, the careful preparations, the lies she would need to tell to explain her behavior, the final walk through the palace gates that would mark the end of everything she had known. She thought, too, of the small life growing inside her, unaware of the storm surrounding its arrival into the world, unaware of the kingdom it was leaving behind before it had even taken its first breath. Whatever came next, Elena promised herself, standing in the candlelit healing chamber, with Agnes watching her with quiet, steady support, she would face it with the same strength that had carried her through the humiliation of the ceremony the night before. She would build something new, something entirely her own, far from the shadow of a king who had rejected her, and a mother who had chosen a crown over her own daughter. The candle flickered between them, casting long shadows across the stone walls, and outside the small window, the moon continued its slow climb through a sky that held no answers, only the quiet promise of whatever lay ahead. The knock at Elena's door came just before midnight, 3 days after she had made her decision, and the sound of it sent her heart slamming against her ribs. She had been kneeling on the floor of her small room, packing the last of her belongings into a worn leather satchel, folding a woolen cloak carefully around a small bundle of coins she had managed to save over the years. She froze at the sound, listening, calculating whether she could hide the bag quickly enough if whoever stood outside decided to enter without waiting for permission. "Elena," Nora's voice, hushed and urgent. "It's me. Let me in." Relief flooded through her, though it did little to slow her racing pulse. She crossed the room quickly and opened the door just enough to pull her friend inside, before closing it again, turning the small lock with fingers that trembled slightly. Nora's eyes swept over the room, taking in the half-packed satchel, the folded cloak, the small pile of dried herbs and provisions gathered near the window. Her expression shifted from confusion to dawning understanding in the space of a few seconds. "You're leaving," Nora said quietly. "Tonight." Elena did not bother denying it. There was no point, not with the evidence spread across the floor between them. "I have to, Nora. You know I can't stay here. I suspected something was happening. You've been different these past few days. Quieter, more distant." Nora sat down slowly on the edge of the narrow bed, her gaze still fixed on the packed satchel. "I told myself I was imagining things. I didn't want to believe you would actually go. I don't have a choice. Everyone has a choice, Elena. You could stay. You could fight for a place in this kingdom that has nothing to do with Damien or your mother. You have skills, you have friends who care about you. You don't have to run away in the middle of the night like a criminal." Elena knelt down beside the satchel again, resuming her careful packing, though her hands moved slower now, weighted by the conversation. "It's not about running away from embarrassment, Nora. There's more to this than what happened in the Great Hall." Something in her tone must have caught Nora's attention, because when Elena glanced up, she found her friend studying her, with an expression of careful, searching concern. "What aren't you telling me?" Elena hesitated, She had promised herself she would carry this secret alone, that no one beyond Agnes would know the truth until she was safely beyond the borders of Moonfall Kingdom. But looking at Nora now, her oldest friend, the girl who had shared secrets with her since they were children, running barefoot through the palace gardens, Elena felt the weight of the lie pressing uncomfortably against her chest. "You have to promise me," Elena said slowly, "that whatever I tell you stays between us. Not even your family, Nora. Not anyone. I promise." Elena took a deep breath, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she told her friend the truth. She watched Nora's face shift through shock, then disbelief, then a kind of fierce, protective understanding that brought unexpected tears to Elena's eyes. "You're carrying his child," Nora breathed, once Elena had finished. "Elena, this changes everything. If the kingdom knew, if Damien knew, surely he would." "He would what?" Elena's voice sharpened, though she kept it low, mindful of the thin walls around them. "Reject the child the same way he rejected me? Or worse, claim the child as an heir while still refusing to acknowledge me as anything more than the woman who happened to carry it? Nora, I have seen how ambition works in that palace. I watched my own mother trade her daughter's happiness for a crown without a moment's hesitation. I will not risk my child becoming a piece on that same board." Nora was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the weight of what Elena had said. "So you're planning to disappear, to raise this child completely on your own, somewhere far from here, and never tell anyone the truth." "That's the plan, yes. It's a lonely plan, Elena. It's a safe one." Elena resumed packing, folding a small stack of clothing into the satchel with more force than necessary. "I would rather my child grow up without a crown, and without a father, than grow up as a pawn in whatever games Damien and my mother are planning to play with each other." Nora rose from the bed and crossed the small room, kneeling down beside Elena and taking her hands, stilling their restless movement. "Then let me help you. Whatever you need, tonight, in the days after you're gone, anything at all. You don't have to do this completely alone." Elena felt her throat tighten, the careful composure she had maintained for days threatening to crack under the weight of her friend's kindness. "You could get in serious trouble, Nora, if anyone discovers you helped me leave." "I don't care." Nora squeezed her hands firmly. "You are my friend, Elena, and what happened to you in that hall was cruel and wrong, no matter what excuses Damien gives for it. I am not going to let you walk out of this kingdom without at least making sure you're safe when you go." The two women spent the next hour finalizing the details of Elena's departure. Nora knew the palace schedules better than almost anyone, having worked among the household staff for years, and she was able to identify the exact window near dawn when the eastern gate guards changed shifts, leaving a brief gap in coverage that Elena could use to slip away unnoticed. "The northern trail," Elena explained, tracing a rough path on a scrap of parchment with a piece of charcoal. "My father showed me the way years ago, before he lost his position. It avoids the main roads entirely, cuts through the old smuggler paths in the hills. If I leave before sunrise, I can put significant distance between myself and the palace before anyone realizes I'm gone." "And where does the trail lead?" "Eventually, to a border town beyond the northern hills. Agnes has written me a letter of introduction to a cousin of hers who settled there. It's not much, but it's a start." Nora studied the rough map for a long moment, then looked up at Elena with an expression of quiet determination. "I'll create a distraction in the morning, if I can. Something to keep attention away from your absence for as long as possible. It won't buy you much time, but every hour matters when you're trying to disappear." "Thank you," Elena said softly, the gratitude in her voice heavier than the simple words could carry. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you for this. You don't need to repay me for anything. Just promise me you'll be careful. And Elena, if you ever find a way to send word, even just to let me know you and the child are safe, please do. I don't need to know where you are. I just need to know you're all right. I promise." The two friends embraced tightly, and when they finally separated, Nora's eyes were bright with unshed tears. She left quietly, a short while later, slipping back through the palace corridors toward her own quarters, leaving Elena alone with the final hours before her departure. Elena spent the remaining time finishing her preparations, checking and rechecking the contents of her satchel, reviewing the rough map she had sketched from memory of her father's old trails. She wrote a short letter to her mother, though even as she composed it, She questioned why she bothered. The letter was brief, stripped of the anger and grief that had consumed her over the past few days. She did not mention Damien. She did not mention the child growing inside her. She simply wrote that she was leaving Moonfall Kingdom to build a life of her own, that her mother should not attempt to search for her, and that she hoped, someday, her mother would understand the weight of the choices she had made. Elena left the letter folded on the small table in her room, weighted down by a single stone she had carried since childhood, a smooth gray pebble her father had given her from the riverbank near their old cottage. It felt fitting, somehow, to leave a piece of him behind in this place, a small reminder that not everyone in her family had chosen ambition over love. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky outside her narrow window, Elena shouldered her satchel and moved silently through the palace corridors, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fierce determination. She kept to the shadows, avoiding the paths most frequently patrolled by guards, moving with the careful, practiced silence her father had taught her years ago during their trips through the northern hills. She reached the eastern gate, just as the guards were beginning their shift change, exactly as Nora had promised. For a heart-stopping moment, she pressed herself against the shadow of the outer wall, watching the two guards exchange brief words before the departing guard moved off toward the barracks, and the new guard settled into position, his attention still adjusting to the early morning light. Elena waited until his back was turned, studying something in the distance, and then she moved. She slipped through the narrow gap in the wall her father had shown her years before, a space concealed by overgrown ivy that most wolves would never notice unless they knew exactly where to look. The stone scraped against her shoulder as she squeezed through, and for a moment she thought she might not fit, her body already beginning to change shape with the pregnancy she was so carefully hiding beneath her cloak. But she made it through, emerging on the far side of the palace walls into the cool morning air, the scent of dew-covered grass and distant pine filling her lungs. She did not look back at the towers rising behind her, did not allow herself even a single glance at the place she had called home for her entire life. Instead, she turned north, toward the hills rising dark against the lightening sky, and she began to walk. The trail her father had shown her was rougher than she remembered, overgrown in places where no one had walked it for years, but the landmarks remained clear enough in her memory to guide her steadily forward. She walked for hours without stopping, pausing only briefly near a small stream to drink and rest her aching legs, always aware of the growing distance between herself and everything she had left behind. By midday, the palace had disappeared entirely from view, swallowed by the rolling hills and dense forest that separated Moonfall Kingdom from the lands beyond its borders. Elena sat on a fallen log near the trail, catching her breath, and for the first time since fleeing the palace walls, she allowed herself to think about what she was truly leaving behind. She thought of Nora, waiting anxiously in the palace to see whether her distraction had worked, whether Elena's absence had gone unnoticed long enough to matter. She thought of Agnes, who had given her the courage and the practical knowledge to make this escape possible. She thought, despite everything, of her mother, wearing a crown that had cost her a daughter, and she wondered whether Corinne would ever truly understand the weight of what she had traded away. And she thought of Damien, standing on that platform with cold eyes and colder words, a man who had no idea that somewhere beyond the borders of his kingdom, his child was already beginning its journey into a world he would never be part of. Elena pressed her hand against her stomach, feeling the quiet, steady reassurance of the life growing there, and she rose from the fallen log with renewed determination. The trail stretched ahead of her, winding further into unfamiliar territory. But for the first time in days, Elena felt something close to hope pushing through the grief and anger that had consumed her since the ceremony. She was free. Whatever waited for her in the border town beyond these hills, whatever challenges she would face raising a child alone in an unfamiliar place, at least it would be hers. No crown taken from her, no mother's ambition standing between her and her own happiness, no king's cold rejection following her every step. Just Elena, and the small, quiet promise of the life she carried, walking steadily toward a future she intended to build entirely on her own terms. The afternoon sun climbed higher above the northern hills, and Elena Voss walked on, leaving Moonfall Kingdom, and everyone in it, further behind with every step. The wolf appeared out of the tree line without warning, and Elena's entire body went rigid with fear. She had been walking for nearly 3 days by then, her supplies dwindling, her legs aching from the uneven terrain of the northern trail, when the large gray wolf stepped onto the path ahead of her, blocking her way forward. For one terrifying moment, she thought she had been followed, that Damien had sent trackers to bring her back, and her hand instinctively moved to the small knife she carried at her belt. Then the wolf shifted, the familiar rippling transformation that marked him as a fellow shifter, rather than any ordinary predator of the forest, and a man stood before her instead, tall and rough around the edges, dressed in worn leather that had clearly seen years of hard use. His eyes were a pale amber, sharp and assessing as they studied her from head to toe. "You're a long way from any pack territory," he said, his voice rough like gravel, "and you're carrying yourself like someone who doesn't want to be found." Elena's grip tightened on her knife, though she doubted it would offer much protection against a wolf who could shift and tear her apart before she managed a single strike. "I'm just passing through." "Passing through to where?" "There's nothing this direction but the border town, and that's still 2 days' walk from here, longer with the pace you're keeping." His gaze flicked briefly, almost imperceptibly, toward the way she held herself, the careful protectiveness of her posture that she had not managed to fully disguise. "You're pregnant." Elena froze, her heart pounding. "That's none of your concern." "No," he agreed easily. "It isn't. I'm not looking for trouble, and I'm certainly not looking to cause any for a woman traveling alone in her condition. Name's Gareth. I run these hills, mostly keeping to myself, occasionally helping travelers who lose their way." "I haven't lost my way." A faint, humorless smile crossed his face. "No, I don't suppose you have. You walk like someone who knows exactly where she's going, and exactly what she's running from." He studied her a moment longer, then shrugged, as though deciding something. "The trail gets rougher up ahead, cuts close to a ravine that's claimed more than a few unwary travelers. If you want, I can guide you as far as the border town. No charge, no questions asked." Elena hesitated, torn between the instinctive caution that had kept her safe throughout her journey, and the practical understanding that she was exhausted, low on supplies, and facing terrain she had never actually traveled herself, only heard described secondhand by her father years before his death. "Why would you help a stranger for nothing?" Gareth's expression shifted, something distant and weathered passing behind his amber eyes. "Because a long time ago, someone helped me when I needed it most, and I never got the chance to repay the debt. Consider this, me passing it forward, if that makes any difference to your decision." Something in his voice, some quiet honesty beneath the rough exterior, convinced Elena to lower her guard, at least slightly. She was not foolish enough to trust him completely, not after everything that had happened in the past week, but she recognized in him something she had not expected to find on this lonely stretch of trail, a fellow outcast, someone who understood what it meant to walk away from a life that no longer fit. "All right," she said finally. "I'll accept your help, but I should warn you, I'm not in a position to pay you for it, whatever your intentions." "I didn't ask for payment," Gareth said simply, and without further conversation, he turned and began walking north along the trail, leaving Elena to follow at her own pace. They traveled together for the remainder of that day, and into the next, Gareth proving true to his word, guiding her carefully around the treacherous ravine and through sections of forest, where the trail nearly disappeared entirely beneath years of undergrowth. He asked no questions about her past, about the kingdom she had clearly left behind, or about the identity of the child's father. Elena found herself grateful for his silence, grateful for the simple, uncomplicated presence of someone who required nothing from her, except the courtesy of walking at a pace her body could manage. On the second evening, as they made camp near a small stream, Gareth finally broke the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "The border town isn't much to look at," he said, tending to a small fire he had built with practiced efficiency. "Mostly a mix of wolves, who don't fit neatly into any pack structure, and humans who've made peace with living alongside shifters. No royal court, no politics beyond who owes who a favor. It's rough, but it's honest." "That sounds like exactly what I need," Elena said, watching the flames dance against the darkening sky. "What's your name?" Gareth asked, glancing up from the fire. "You never told me, and I figure if we're spending days traveling together, I should at least know what to call you." Elena considered the question carefully. She had thought about this moment during her long hours of walking, had understood that the identity she carried into the border town needed to be different from the one she was leaving behind. A new name felt like the first true step toward the life she intended to build. Lena, she said finally, shortening her own name just enough to feel like a fresh start without abandoning her identity entirely. Lena Marsh. If Gareth noticed the slight hesitation before she spoke the surname, he did not comment on it. He simply nodded, accepting the introduction without further question, and returned his attention to the fire. They reached the border town on the afternoon of the fourth day, and Elena, now Lena, found herself standing at the edge of a settlement unlike anything she had known within the walls of Moonfall Kingdom. The buildings were simple, constructed from timber and stone rather than the polished marble of the palace, and the streets bustled with a mix of people she had never seen, intermingling so freely before. Wolves walking alongside humans, children of both kinds playing together in the dusty roads, without a hint of the rigid hierarchy she had grown up within. "This is where I leave you," Gareth said, stopping at the edge of the main road leading into town. "The healer's cottage is near the center, close to the old well. Tell them Agnes sent you, if you've got that letter she mentioned." Elena, still adjusting to the sound of her new name in her own mind, turned to face him fully. "Thank you, Gareth. I mean that. I don't know how I would have made it through some of that trail without your help." "You'd have managed," he said, though something in his expression suggested he did not entirely believe his own words. "You strike me as someone who manages, one way or another, but you're welcome all the same." He paused, studying her for a long moment. "If you ever need anything, ask around for me. Most folks in these hills know where to find me, even if I don't stay in any one place for long." "I will." Gareth nodded once, then turned and walked back toward the tree line, disappearing into the forest without another word, leaving Elena standing alone at the edge of her new life. She made her way into town slowly, taking in the unfamiliar sights and sounds, the smell of wood smoke and fresh bread mingling with the earthier scents of the nearby forest. She found the healer's cottage, exactly where Gareth had described, a modest stone building near the town's central well, smoke curling from a chimney that promised warmth within. The woman who answered her knock was younger than Elena had expected, perhaps in her 30s, with sharp eyes and calloused hands that spoke of years spent working with herbs and healing remedies. She studied Elena carefully before speaking. "You look like you've walked a long way to get here." "I have." Elena reached into her satchel and produced the letter Agnes had written, slightly worn from days of travel, but still legible. "Agnes Hart sent me. She said you might be able to help me find work, and perhaps a place to stay." The woman took the letter, her expression shifting with surprise as she recognized the handwriting. "Agnes, I haven't heard from my cousin in years." She read through the letter quickly, her eyes flicking up occasionally to study Elena's face, her posture, the careful way she carried herself. "She says you're skilled with herbs and healing work, and that you need a fresh start, no questions asked." "That's correct." The woman folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her apron. "My name is Miriam. I run this healing cottage, though I could certainly use another set of capable hands, especially with your condition." Her gaze dropped briefly, pointedly, to Elena's midsection. "How far along are you?" "Nearly 4 months now." Miriam nodded, seemingly unbothered by the lack of explanation regarding the child's father, or the circumstances that had brought Elena to her doorstep alone, and clearly fleeing something significant. "Then we have some time before you'll need to slow down. Come inside. Let's discuss what an arrangement between us might look like." Elena followed her into the cottage, grateful beyond words for the warmth of the small fire burning in the hearth, for the simple kindness of a woman who asked no uncomfortable questions and offered no judgment for the life Elena had clearly left behind. Over the following weeks, Elena settled into a rhythm entirely different from anything she had known within the palace walls. She learned Miriam's methods for preparing healing remedies, spent long hours grinding herbs and tending to the small garden behind the cottage where Miriam grew most of her medicinal plants. The work was physical and demanding, but Elena found a strange comfort in it, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with crowns or bloodlines, or the politics of Moonfall Kingdom. She rented a small room above the town's modest inn, paid for with the coins she had saved before her departure, and the modest wages Miriam offered for her assistance. The room was simple, nothing like the guest quarters she had once occupied near the royal wing, but it was hers, entirely and completely, in a way nothing in the palace had ever truly been. As the weeks passed and her pregnancy progressed, Elena found herself thinking less frequently about Damien's cold rejection, about her mother's triumphant acceptance of the crown, about the life she had left behind in Moonfall Kingdom. The border town, with its rough honesty, and its mixture of humans and wolves living side by side, without the rigid hierarchy of pack politics, offered her something she had not realized she desperately needed: anonymity, and the quiet freedom to simply exist, without the weight of expectations that had followed her for her entire life. She still thought of them sometimes, late at night when sleep would not come easily, memories of the ceremony surfacing unbidden in the darkness of her small room. But each time, she reminded herself of the choice she had made, the future she was building for herself, and for the child growing steadily within her, and the memories gradually lost some of their sharpest edges, softening into something she could carry, without being crushed beneath their weight. Gareth returned to town occasionally over those weeks, checking in with a casual regularity that Elena suspected was more deliberate than he let on. He never asked about her past, never pressed for details about the child's father, or the life she had clearly left behind, but he brought her small gifts sometimes: fresh game from his hunts, wild herbs he thought Miriam might find useful, a warm blanket he claimed to have simply found, and had no use for himself. Elena found herself grateful for his quiet, undemanding friendship, a steady presence in a life that had been upended so completely just weeks before. She did not know, in those early months of her new life in the border town, how significant that friendship would eventually become, how much she would come to rely on Gareth's steady presence as the years unfolded and the secret of her child's true heritage grew more difficult to protect. But for now, in the quiet rhythm of her new life, surrounded by the healing work she found genuinely fulfilling, and the growing life within her that represented her only true connection to the kingdom she had left behind, Elena allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to feel something close to peace. Whatever challenges awaited her in the months and years ahead, she had made it this far. She had escaped the humiliation of the Great Hall, the betrayal of her mother's ambition, the cold rejection of a king who had never known the truth he was walking away from. She was building something new, something entirely her own, and as she pressed her hand against her growing stomach one quiet evening, watching the sun set over the unfamiliar rooftops of her new home, Elena Voss, now known simply as Lena Marsh, allowed herself to hope that the worst of her journey was finally behind her. She could not have known, in that peaceful moment, how much more difficult the road ahead would truly become. The pain hit Elena so suddenly that she nearly dropped the jar of dried lavender she had been carrying across the healing cottage, and Miriam was at her side in an instant, her sharp eyes reading the situation immediately. "It's time," Miriam said, guiding Elena firmly toward the small back room, where she attended the more serious healing cases. "Breathe through it. I need you to breathe." Elena gripped the edge of the doorframe, another wave of pain rolling through her body, and for one disoriented moment she thought of the great hall in Moonfall Kingdom, of the crown resting on her mother's head, of everything that had led her to this small room in a border town she had called home for only 7 months. Then the pain crested again, sharper this time, and every thought beyond the present moment burned away entirely. "Where's Gareth?" Elena managed to ask between breaths, some part of her desperately hoping for a familiar face beyond Miriam, someone who had become, over these past months, closer to family than anyone she had left behind in her old life. "I sent word to him the moment your labor began," Miriam said, helping Elena onto the narrow bed prepared with clean linens and the various supplies she would need in the hours ahead. "He should arrive soon, but Elena, right now, you need to focus on this, on the child. Nothing else matters." The hours that followed blurred together in Elena's memory into a haze of pain and exhaustion, and Miriam's steady, reassuring voice guiding her through each contraction. She was vaguely aware of Gareth's arrival partway through, of his rough hands gripping hers tightly during the worst of the pain, offering silent strength when she had none left of her own to draw upon. She remembered thinking, somewhere in the fog of labor, that she had never expected to face this moment surrounded by strangers who had somehow become the closest thing to family she had left in the world, rather than in the palace she had grown up believing would always be her home. When her son finally arrived, just as dawn began to break over the border town, the sound of his first cry cut through Elena's exhaustion, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Miriam placed the small, squirming bundle against her chest, and Elena stared down at her son for the first time, tears streaming freely down her face as she took in every detail of his tiny features. He had her dark hair, thick even at birth, but as she studied his face more closely, she recognized other features that made her breath catch in her throat. The shape of his eyes, still closed but promising, she suspected. The same storm-gray color that had once made her heart race beneath an old oak tree. The strong line of his jaw, so clearly inherited from a father who would never know he existed. "He's beautiful," Gareth said quietly from where he stood near the doorway, giving her privacy while still remaining close enough to offer support if needed. "What will you name him?" Elena looked down at her son, this small, perfect life that represented everything she had sacrificed and everything she had gained in the 7 months since fleeing Moonfall Kingdom. She thought of her father, gone now for 6 years, the man who had taught her the trails that led her to this new life, who had shown her kindness and love in a household that had grown increasingly consumed by her mother's ambitions. "Cade," she said softly, testing the name against the quiet morning air. "Cade Marsh." She chose deliberately not to give him the Ashford name, not to give him any connection to the kingdom, and the king who had rejected her so publicly. Whatever bloodline ran through his veins, whatever power or heritage he might someday discover within himself, Elena was determined that he would grow up knowing only the identity she had built for both of them, here in this border town, far from the politics and ambition that had shaped her own difficult childhood. Miriam, watching from nearby, offered a tired but genuine smile. "A strong name for a strong boy. Welcome to the world, Cade Marsh." The following weeks passed in a haze of new motherhood, Elena adjusting to the exhausting rhythm of caring for a newborn, while still managing her responsibilities at the healing cottage, though Miriam insisted on giving her ample time to rest and recover. Gareth visited frequently during those early weeks, bringing fresh game and offering to help with tasks around Elena's small room that had become increasingly difficult to manage while caring for an infant. "You don't have to keep doing this," Elena told him one afternoon, watching as he expertly repaired a loose shutter on her window, Cade sleeping peacefully in a small basket nearby. "I can manage on my own." "I know you can," Gareth said, not pausing in his work. "Doesn't mean you have to." Elena studied his weathered profile as he worked, considering, not for the first time, the strange path that had brought this rough, solitary wolf into her life at exactly the moment she needed a guide through unfamiliar territory. She had learned little of his own history over the months of their acquaintance, only vague references to a pack he had left behind years before, a past he clearly preferred not to discuss in detail. "Why do you do this, Gareth? Really? You could have simply guided me to town all those months ago and gone on with your own life. Instead, you keep coming back, checking on us, helping without being asked." Gareth set down his tools and turned to face her fully, something serious settling into his amber eyes. "I told you once, someone helped me when I needed it most. I never got the chance to repay that debt properly. But it's more than that now, if I'm honest." He glanced toward the sleeping infant in the basket, then back to Elena. "You and the boy, you've become important to me. I don't have much family left of my own, not since I left my old pack. Watching out for you two, it gives me something worth doing." Elena felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest at his words, a gratitude that went beyond simple appreciation for practical help. In the months since arriving in the border town, Gareth had become something she had not expected to find again after the devastating betrayal of Moonfall Kingdom. Someone she could trust completely, without reservation or fear of hidden agendas. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." Gareth simply nodded, returning his attention to the shutter, though Elena noticed the faint color that had risen in his weathered cheeks, a small crack in his usually stoic exterior. As Cade grew from a squirming infant into an alert, curious baby, Elena found herself settling more deeply into the rhythm of her new life. She continued working alongside Miriam at the healing cottage, gradually taking on more responsibility as her skills developed, until she had become nearly as knowledgeable about the local herbs and remedies as Miriam herself. The wages, combined with the small savings she had carried from Moonfall Kingdom, allowed her to move into a slightly larger room above the inn, one with enough space for Cade's growing needs. The border town's unique blend of humans and wolves, living together without the rigid hierarchy Elena had grown up within, proved to be exactly the environment she had hoped it would be. No one questioned her past too closely. No one recognized the Voss name or connected her quiet, hard-working presence to the scandal that had rocked Moonfall Kingdom months before. She was simply Lena Marsh, a skilled healer's assistant raising her son alone, one of many similar stories scattered throughout the settlement's diverse population. But even in the peaceful rhythm of her new life, Elena remained cautious, aware that Cade's heritage carried within it a danger she could not entirely escape, simply by changing her name and crossing a kingdom's borders. She watched him carefully as he grew, noting the way his eyes had settled into a striking gray that matched his father's exactly, the way his small hands seemed unusually strong for an infant his age, the subtle signs that suggested he carried more than an ordinary wolf's bloodline within him. "He's going to be strong," Miriam observed one afternoon, watching as Cade, not yet a year old, pulled himself upright against a low table, with surprising determination and strength. "Stronger than most pups his age, if I'm any judge." Elena said nothing, though she felt a familiar knot of worry tighten in her stomach. She had suspected as much herself, had noticed the small signs that suggested her son carried within him traits that marked him as something beyond an ordinary wolf, traits that traced directly back to the powerful Ashford bloodline his father represented, whether Damien knew of his existence or not. "He takes after his father in some ways," Elena said carefully, choosing her words with the caution she had maintained since arriving in the border town months before. Miriam glanced at her, curiosity evident in her expression, though she had never pressed for details about Cade's father, beyond what Elena chose to share voluntarily. "Someone important, I take it, given how carefully you avoid the subject." "Someone I'd rather not discuss," Elena replied, and Miriam, respecting the boundary as she always had, let the matter drop without further questions. But privately, watching her son grow stronger and more clearly marked by his powerful heritage with each passing month, Elena understood that the peaceful anonymity she had found in the border town might not remain indefinitely secure. Wolves with sharp senses and sharper political instincts existed even in remote settlements like this one, and the day might come when someone recognized the signs she saw so clearly herself, when someone connected the pieces and understood exactly whose bloodline ran through her son's veins. She resolved, watching Cade sleep peacefully in his small bed that evening, that she would face that danger, when and if it arrived, rather than allowing fear of an uncertain future to poison the peace she had worked so hard to build in the present. Whatever challenges awaited them, she had already proven, through the difficult months of pregnancy and the exhausting early days of motherhood, that she possessed a strength she had not fully recognized within herself before the night of her rejection in Moonfall Kingdom's Great Hall. She would protect her son, whatever it required, however far she needed to run, or however carefully she needed to guard their secret. The kingdom that had rejected her, the mother who had chosen ambition over family, the king who had turned away without ever knowing the truth he was walking from, none of them would ever have the chance to use her son as a tool in whatever games occupied the halls of Moonfall Kingdom. As the seasons continued to change and Cade grew from an infant into a sturdy, curious toddler, Elena allowed herself to believe, cautiously but genuinely, that she had truly succeeded in building the new life she had promised herself on that lonely night in the palace gardens, months before her son's birth. The border town had become home in every meaningful sense, its rough honesty and diverse community offering exactly the freedom and safety she had desperately needed. She did not know, watching her son take his first unsteady steps across the healing cottage floor, while Miriam and Gareth both cheered him on with genuine affection, how many more years of this peaceful anonymity remained before the past she had worked so hard to escape would finally begin catching up with her. Corinne Voss stood alone on the balcony overlooking the moon pool, gripping the stone railing so tightly her knuckles had turned white, and she did not turn around when Damien's footsteps approached from behind her. "The Southern Pack sent word this morning," Damien said, his voice carrying none of the warmth it once held during the early days of their arrangement. "They're questioning whether Moonfall Kingdom still commands the respect it once did. They're asking why our borders feel less secure than they did a year ago." "I'm aware of the reports," Corinne said, still facing the moon pool below, watching the silver light shimmer across its surface. "I read the same messages you do, Damien. You don't need to remind me of our kingdom's difficulties, as though I'm somehow responsible for causing them." Aren't you? His voice had grown sharper over the months since their bonding ceremony, an edge of frustration that had become increasingly familiar. A Luna is meant to strengthen the pack bond, to reinforce the Alpha's connection to his territory and his people. Instead, I feel weaker with each passing month, Corinne. The bond between us has never settled the way it should have. Corinne finally turned to face him, her expression carefully composed, despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. 2 years had passed since the night she accepted the crown that should have belonged to her daughter. 2 years during which the kingdom's stability had steadily eroded, despite her best efforts to fulfill the role expected of her. You knew this bond was forced from the very beginning, she said quietly. You chose me knowing full well that I was not your fated mate, that whatever connection existed between us was born of convenience and political necessity, rather than the natural pull that should exist between an Alpha and his Luna. You cannot blame me now for the consequences of that choice. Damien's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Corinne saw something flicker behind his gray eyes that looked remarkably like regret, though he quickly masked it beneath his usual composed authority. The pack elders are beginning to whisper, he said, changing tactics. They question why our bond feels incomplete, why the territory itself seems less settled beneath our joint rule than it did under previous Alphas and their true Lunas. Some are even suggesting that we made an error 2 years ago, that the ceremony should never have proceeded the way it did. Corinne felt a familiar cold fear settle in her stomach, the same fear that had haunted her since accepting Damien's offer on that fateful night. She had known, even then, that a forced bond carried risks, that the ancient magic binding an Alpha to his Luna required a genuine connection to function at full strength. She had convinced herself that ambition and careful strategy could overcome what nature had not provided, but 2 years of steadily mounting evidence suggested she had been wrong. What are you suggesting, Damien? That we simply abandon 2 years of rule together because a few elders are gossiping about bonds and territory? I'm suggesting, Damien said, his voice low and controlled, that perhaps we made a mistake that night, one that continues to weaken this kingdom with every month that passes. I have tried, Corinne. I have genuinely tried to make this arrangement work, for the sake of stability if nothing else. But I cannot ignore the evidence any longer. This bond is failing, and Moonfall Kingdom is suffering because of it. Corinne turned away from him, staring out at the moon pool once more, her mind racing through the implications of his words. If Damien began to seriously question their bond, if the pack elders continued their whispered doubts, her position as Luna, everything she had sacrificed her own daughter's happiness to secure, could collapse entirely. There must be something we can do, she said finally. Some ritual, some strengthening ceremony that could reinforce what nature failed to provide naturally. I've consulted the pack historians, Damien admitted. They speak of ancient rites that might temporarily strengthen a forced bond, but nothing permanent, nothing that addresses the fundamental problem at the heart of this arrangement. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made Corinne's stomach clench with dread. The truth is, Corinne, a bond born from ambition rather than genuine connection may simply be incapable of the strength this kingdom requires. So what do you propose? That you reject me as well, the way you rejected my daughter? The words hung heavy in the air between them, and Corinne watched Damien's expression carefully, searching for any sign of the answer she both feared and, in some hidden corner of her heart she rarely acknowledged, almost hoped for. If Damien rejected her, her position would collapse entirely, her ambitions crumbling to dust after 2 years of sacrifice. But some part of her, the part that still remembered her daughter's devastated face in the Great Hall 2 years before, wondered whether such a collapse might not be entirely undeserved. I don't know what I propose, Damien said finally, turning away from her to stare out at the same moon pool that had witnessed so much of their shared history over the past 2 years. I only know that something must change, and soon, before this kingdom's weakness becomes visible to enemies who would gladly exploit it. Corinne remained silent, watching him, and for the first time in 2 years, she allowed herself to think seriously about her daughter, about Elena's disappearance the morning after the ceremony, about the letter she had left behind, that Corinne had read 100 times since, searching for clues about where her daughter might have gone, whether she was safe, whether she had ever forgiven the choice her mother had made that night. She had not searched for Elena, not truly. not with the resources and authority she now possessed as Luna. Some part of her had told herself that Elena needed space, that pursuing her would only deepen the wound between them. But standing here now, watching the kingdom she had sacrificed everything to help rule begin to crumble regardless of her sacrifice, Corinne wondered whether her restraint had been born from respect for her daughter's wishes, or from simple cowardice, an unwillingness to face the full weight of what she had done. "I should have searched for her," Corinne said quietly, more to herself than to Damien. He turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. "For Elena? She's my daughter, Damien. Whatever happened between the three of us that night, whatever choices we both made, she is still my daughter, and I let her walk away, without ever trying to understand where she went, or whether she was safe." Corinne's voice trembled slightly, an unexpected crack in the composed authority she had maintained for 2 years. "I told myself I was respecting her wishes, but perhaps I was simply afraid of what I would find if I looked too closely at the consequences of my own choices." Damien said nothing for a long moment, his gaze distant, and Corinne wondered whether he, too, harbored regrets about that fateful night that he had never fully voiced, even to himself. "I have wondered about her as well," he admitted finally, his voice quiet, in a way Corinne rarely heard from the powerful Alpha King. "Whether the bond I sensed weakening before the ceremony was truly as broken as I believed, or whether I acted too hastily, influenced by pressures I should have resisted more carefully." Corinne studied his face, surprised by the admission, though she said nothing to interrupt whatever thoughts were clearly working through his mind. "The elders pressured me for months before that ceremony," Damien continued. "They spoke of stability, of the importance of choosing a Luna whose family carried influence and resources the kingdom desperately needed, after years of strain following the border conflicts. Elena's family, despite her father's fall from grace, still carried weight among certain factions, and you, Corinne, you possess the ambition and political instinct that the elders believed the kingdom required in its next Luna. You're saying the elders influenced your decision that night. I'm saying," Damien said carefully, "that I have spent 2 years telling myself the bond between Elena and me had genuinely weakened, that my choice was born from instinct rather than external pressure. But standing here now, watching this kingdom suffer under a bond that never should have existed in the first place, I find myself questioning whether I was honest with myself, or with her, about the true reasons behind that rejection." The confession hung heavy between them, and Corinne felt a complicated mixture of emotions swirl through her chest, guilt and vindication, and a strange, unexpected sympathy for the daughter she had wronged so completely 2 years before. "If you believe you made a mistake," Corinne said slowly, "what do you intend to do about it now? Elena is gone, Damien. Wherever she went, she left no trace, no way for either of us to find her, even if we wanted to make amends." "I don't know," Damien admitted, "but I know that this kingdom cannot continue suffering under a bond that both of us now suspect was built on a foundation of political convenience rather than genuine connection. Something must change, Corinne, whether we find Elena or not." The conversation left Corinne standing alone on the balcony long after Damien had departed, her mind churning through 2 years of choices and consequences she had spent considerable effort avoiding direct confrontation with. She thought of her daughter's face in the great hall, devastated and humiliated in front of hundreds of witnesses. She thought of the small stone paperweight she had found holding down Elena's brief farewell letter, a smooth gray pebble she recognized from her late husband's collection, a piece of him Elena had chosen to leave behind rather than carry with her into whatever new life she had built. Corinne had kept that letter, folded carefully in a drawer in her private chambers, reading it occasionally during quiet moments when the weight of her choices grew too heavy to ignore entirely. She had told herself, over and over across 2 years, that she had done what was necessary to protect their family's position within the kingdom, that ambition and pragmatism had guided choices that ultimately served everyone's best interests, even if Elena could not yet see the wisdom in her mother's decisions. Standing on the balcony now, watching the moon pool shimmer below while the kingdom she had sacrificed everything to help govern continued its slow decline into instability, Corinne allowed herself, for the first time in 2 years, to seriously question whether her choices had truly been wise at all, or whether ambition had simply blinded her to the genuine cost of what she had done to her own daughter. The moon climbed higher above the palace, indifferent as always to the doubts and regrets of those who ruled beneath its light. And Corinne remained on the balcony long into the night, wondering, with growing unease, whether the consequences of that fateful ceremony 2 years before were only just beginning to unfold. Cade hit the training post so hard that the wood splintered clean through, and the entire yard fell silent. Elena stood frozen near the Healing Cottage's garden fence, a basket of freshly gathered herbs slipping from her fingers, watching her 5-year-old son stare down at the shattered wooden post with an expression of confused alarm rather than pride. Around him, a small cluster of other children who had been practicing basic sparring drills under old Edmund Cole's watchful supervision had gone completely still, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something that looked uncomfortably close to fear. "Cade!" Elena called, hurrying across the yard, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Are you hurt?" "I didn't mean to hit it that hard," Cade said, his voice small and confused, as he looked between his own hands and the broken post, as though trying to understand how such destruction had come from his small fists. "I was just practicing, like Edmund showed us." Edmund Cole, a retired soldier who had settled in the border town years before, and now spent his days teaching basic self-defense to the settlement's children, approached slowly, his weathered face carrying an expression Elena had never seen him wear before. He knelt down beside the broken post, examining the splintered wood with careful, deliberate attention, before turning his gaze toward Cade. "That's a mighty strong hit for a boy your age," Edmund said, his voice carefully neutral, though Elena could hear the calculation running beneath his measured tone. "Stronger than I've seen from boys twice your age, if I'm honest." Elena reached her son and pulled him close, her hands checking automatically for any injury, despite knowing the strike had clearly caused him no harm at all. Over his shoulder, she caught Edmund's continued scrutiny, and something cold settled in her stomach. "He's always been a strong boy," Elena said, keeping her voice light despite the growing unease building within her chest. "Must be all the fresh air out here in the hills." Edmund's eyes lifted to meet hers, and Elena saw immediately that he was not entirely convinced by her casual explanation. "Fresh air doesn't usually produce that kind of strength in a 5-year-old, Lena. I've trained soldiers for 30 years. I know unusual strength when I see it." "What are you suggesting?" Elena kept her tone carefully casual, though her arms tightened protectively around her son. "I'm not suggesting anything," Edmund said, though his careful phrasing suggested otherwise. "Just observing. Some bloodlines carry more strength than others. That's all I meant by it." He said nothing further on the matter, returning his attention to the remaining children and their training exercises, but Elena noticed the way his gaze occasionally drifted back toward Cade throughout the remainder of the session, thoughtful and assessing in a way that made her increasingly nervous. That evening, after putting Cade to bed in their small room above the inn, Elena sat alone by the window, staring out at the darkened streets of the border town, while turning Edmund's words over in her mind. She had known, of course, that Cade carried unusual strength for his age, had noticed the signs herself over the years since his birth, the way he had walked earlier than other children, the way he had small hands gripped objects with surprising force, the way his eyes had settled into that unmistakable storm gray that so clearly marked his heritage. She had told herself, across 5 years of careful, quiet life in the border town, that such traits could remain hidden indefinitely if she remained vigilant, if she taught Cade to moderate his strength around others, if she continued the careful anonymity that had protected them both since fleeing Moonfall Kingdom. But watching the way Edmund's expression had shifted that afternoon, the calculation clearly working behind his experienced eyes, Elena understood with growing dread that her careful precautions might not remain sufficient for much longer. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts, and she opened it to find Gareth standing in the narrow hallway, his expression serious, in a way that immediately confirmed her worst fears. "Word travels fast in a small town," he said quietly, stepping inside, once she waved him in. "Edmund mentioned what happened at training today. Elena, we need to talk about this seriously." "I know." Elena sank down onto the edge of her narrow bed, exhaustion and worry pressing heavily against her shoulders. "I've been trying to teach him control, Gareth, but he's only 5. He doesn't fully understand his own strength yet, and I can't exactly explain to him why he needs to hide it, without explaining everything else along with it." Gareth sat down beside her, his expression thoughtful. "How much does Miriam know?" about where Cade's strength comes from. Nothing beyond what I've told everyone here, that his father was someone I'd rather not discuss. Elena rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of 5 years of careful secrecy pressing against her more heavily than usual tonight. I've never told anyone the full truth, Gareth. Not even you, not really. Gareth was quiet for a long moment, watching her carefully. You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share, Elena. I've never pushed you for details these past 5 years, and I'm not going to start now. But if there's a genuine danger here, if Cade's heritage could bring trouble to this town, or to the two of you specifically, I need to understand enough to help protect you both properly. Elena studied his weathered face, the genuine concern evident in his amber eyes, and she felt the familiar weight of the secret she had carried alone for so long grow suddenly, unbearably heavy. She had trusted Gareth with so much over the years, had come to rely on his steady presence in ways she had not expected when he first appeared on that lonely forest trail 5 years before. Perhaps, she thought, it was finally time to trust him with the whole truth. Cade's father, she began slowly, choosing her words with careful deliberation, is not simply some ordinary wolf I'd rather not discuss for personal reasons. He is the alpha king of a kingdom far from here, a man with considerable power and an equally considerable number of enemies, who would very much like to use any weakness against him. Gareth's expression shifted through surprise, then dawning understanding, though he said nothing, waiting for her to continue. Cade carries his father's bloodline, Elena continued, which means he carries traits and strength that mark him as something far beyond an ordinary child. I left that kingdom before his birth, before anyone could discover the truth, because I refused to let my son become a pawn in whatever political games surrounded his father's throne. And you're afraid that Edmund noticing his strength today might lead to that truth eventually coming out. I'm afraid, Elena admitted, that the longer we stay in one place, the harder it becomes to hide what Cade truly is. He's growing stronger every year, Gareth. Eventually, someone is going to notice traits that go beyond simple childhood strength, and when they do, word could travel back to the kingdom I left behind. Gareth was quiet for a long moment, processing the weight of what she had shared. Do you want to leave? Find somewhere else, somewhere even more remote where his heritage might remain hidden longer. Elena considered the question seriously, weighing the exhausting prospect of uprooting the stable life she had built over 5 years, against the growing danger of remaining in a place where Cade's true nature might eventually be discovered. I don't know, she admitted finally. This town has become home, Gareth. Miriam has become like family to me, and you, she paused, meeting his eyes directly. You've become someone I genuinely trust, someone I don't know how I would have managed these past 5 years without. Leaving all of that behind, starting over again, somewhere completely unfamiliar, the thought exhausts me. Then perhaps, Gareth said carefully, the answer isn't necessarily to leave, but to prepare more carefully for whatever might come. Teach Cade better control over his strength, yes, but also make sure you and I both understand exactly what kind of danger we might be facing, so we can respond appropriately if word ever does begin to spread. Elena nodded slowly, grateful for his measured, practical response, rather than the panic she had half expected. You're right. Running away again isn't necessarily the answer, not yet. But I do need to be more careful, more vigilant about Cade's training, and about who might be watching him too closely. Over the following weeks, Elena worked patiently with Cade, teaching him gentle exercises to help him understand and moderate his own strength, framing the lessons as games rather than warnings, careful not to burden her young son with fears he was not yet old enough to fully comprehend. She spoke privately with Edmund as well, thanking him for his discretion regarding the incident and asking, without fully explaining her reasons, that he keep his observations about Cade's unusual strength to himself. Edmund, to his credit, agreed, without pressing for further explanation, though Elena noticed the thoughtful way he continued watching Cade during subsequent training sessions, clearly filing away observations he chose not to voice aloud. Gareth, true to his word, became an even more constant presence in their lives, following that difficult conversation, spending increasing amounts of time with both Elena and Cade, teaching the boy practical woodland skills, alongside careful lessons in controlling his growing strength. Elena watched the gentle, patient way Gareth interacted with her son, the genuine affection that had clearly grown between them over the years, and she found herself grateful, more deeply than she could easily express, for the family she had managed to build in this unlikely border town, so different from the family she had left behind in Moonfall Kingdom. But even as life settled into its familiar rhythm once more, Elena remained watchful, aware that the incident with the training post represented only the first small crack in the careful anonymity she had maintained for 5 years. She did not know how much longer that anonymity could hold, how much longer she could shield her son's true heritage from a world that seemed, with each passing year, increasingly likely to eventually discover the truth she had worked so hard to protect. She only knew that whatever came next, whatever dangers eventually found their way to this small border town, she would face them with the same fierce determination that had carried her through pregnancy, childbirth, and 5 years of careful, quiet survival, far from the crown and the kingdom that had once tried to claim her future, without ever understanding the price of what they had truly lost. The stranger arrived in the border town on a gray morning, nearly a year after the incident with the training post, and Elena knew the moment she saw him crossing the town square that her carefully constructed peace was about to shatter. She was returning from the market with a basket of fresh vegetables when she first noticed him, a tall man in traveling clothes that were finely made despite their practical cut, clothes that marked him as someone accustomed to resources far beyond what most border town residents possessed. He moved through the square with the careful, observant gait of someone trained to notice details others might overlook, his eyes scanning the buildings and the people around him with an intensity that immediately set Elena's instincts on alert. She ducked quickly into the shadow of a nearby doorway, watching him from a safe distance, her heart pounding with a fear she had not felt this acutely since the early days of her flight from Moonfall Kingdom. Something about his bearing, the quality of his clothing, the sharp assessment in his gaze, all of it screamed palace-trained, and Elena's mind raced through the implications of what his presence in this remote settlement might mean. She made her way home quickly, avoiding the main streets, and found Miriam in the healing cottage, her expression immediately concerned when she saw Elena's pale, hurried entrance. "Elena, what's wrong?" "There's a man in the square," Elena said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "A stranger, dressed too well for this town, moving like someone trained to notice things, to search for things. Miriam, I think someone has finally traced me here." Miriam's expression sobered immediately, understanding the weight of what Elena was telling her. Though the older woman had never pressed for the full details of the past Elena had so carefully guarded over the 6 years of their acquaintance. "Where's Cade?" "With Gareth, in the eastern forest, practicing his tracking skills." Elena pressed her hands against her temples, trying to think clearly, despite the panic clawing at her chest. "I need to find them," warned Gareth. "Get Cade somewhere safe, until I understand exactly what this stranger wants." "Go," Miriam said firmly. "I'll keep watch here, see what I can learn about this visitor, without drawing attention to myself. Send word, the moment you're somewhere safe." Elena hurried from the cottage, taking the back paths through town rather than the main square, her mind racing through 6 years of careful precautions that suddenly felt woefully inadequate against the possibility that someone from Moonfall Kingdom had finally tracked her down. She found the eastern forest trail quickly, following the familiar path toward the clearing where Gareth often took Cade for their training sessions. She heard them before she saw them, Cade's delighted laughter carrying through the trees as Gareth demonstrated some tracking technique involving broken twigs and disturbed earth. Elena burst into the clearing, breathless from her hurried journey, and both of them turned toward her with immediate concern at her obvious distress. "Elena, what happened?" Gareth was on his feet instantly, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. "A stranger arrived in town this morning," Elena explained quickly, kneeling down to pull Cade into a protective embrace, despite his confused protests. "Someone who doesn't belong here. Someone who moves like palace-trained tracker. Gareth, I think he might be looking for us." Gareth's expression darkened with understanding. "You think this is connected to Cade's father?" "I don't know for certain, but I can't take the risk of assuming otherwise." Elena held her son close, feeling his small body tense with the confusion of sensing his mother's fear, without fully understanding its cause. "We need to get somewhere safe, somewhere this stranger won't think to look, at least until we understand what he actually wants." They made their way deeper into the forest, toward a small hunting cabin Gareth maintained for occasions when his solitary lifestyle required more privacy than the border town could offer. Elena kept Cade close throughout the journey, her mind racing through every possible scenario, Every reason a palace-trained stranger might have found his way to this remote settlement after 6 years of careful anonymity. They had barely settled into the small cabin when the sound of approaching footsteps outside sent Gareth's hand immediately to his knife once more, positioning himself protectively between the doorway and Elena and Cade. But the figure who emerged from the tree line was not the stranger Elena had seen in the town square. It was Miriam, breathless from what had clearly been a hurried journey through the forest. "I found out what I could," Miriam said, catching her breath as she stepped into the cabin. "He's been asking questions around town, careful questions, but questions nonetheless. Asking about a woman who might have arrived here alone, pregnant, roughly 6 or 7 years ago. Asking whether anyone remembers a child with unusual strength, unusual coloring." Elena's heart sank, all her worst fears confirming themselves in Miriam's careful report. "Did anyone tell him anything?" "Not that I could determine, though I can't be entirely certain what others might have said before I learned of his presence." Miriam's expression was grave. "Elena, he mentioned something else as well. Something that concerned me deeply. He's not simply searching randomly. He specifically mentioned investigating disturbances along the kingdom's borders, disruptions in the natural bond magic that connects an alpha to his territory. He seems to believe those disturbances might be connected to something, or someone, located outside the kingdom's borders entirely." Gareth's brow furrowed with confusion. What would border disturbances have to do with a child living in a remote settlement? Elena felt a cold understanding settle over her. A piece of the puzzle she had not previously considered clicking suddenly into place. "The bond," she said slowly. "Damien's forced bond with my mother. If it's failing, if it's genuinely weak, the way everyone always suspected it would be, that weakness could be destabilizing the kingdom's territorial magic. And if a tracker is searching for the source of that instability, he might trace it back to an unclaimed heir." Gareth finished grimly, his eyes moving toward Cade, who sat quietly in the corner of the cabin, sensing the tension in the room despite not fully understanding its source. A powerful bloodline connection existing outside the kingdom's borders, uncontained and unclaimed, could genuinely disrupt the territorial bond magic that keeps a kingdom stable. Elena pressed her hand against her mouth, the implications washing over her in a devastating wave. She had fled Moonfall Kingdom to protect her son from becoming a pawn in political games, had believed that distance and anonymity would be sufficient protection against a kingdom that did not even know he existed. She had never considered that the very existence of a powerful, unclaimed bloodline heir might create magical disturbances capable of drawing unwanted attention, regardless of how carefully she guarded their location. "We need to leave," Elena said, her voice tight with renewed panic. "Tonight, before this tracker gets any closer to the truth." "Elena," Miriam's voice was gentle but firm. "Running again might only delay the inevitable. If the disturbance itself is drawing attention regardless of your location, perhaps it's time to consider a different approach." What approach could possibly be safer than simply staying hidden? Miriam glanced toward Gareth before answering, some silent communication passing between the two adults that Elena did not entirely understand. "Perhaps," Miriam said carefully, "it's time to consider confronting the truth directly, on your own terms, rather than waiting for someone else to discover it and control how that revelation unfolds." Elena stared at her friend, the suggestion landing with unexpected weight. 6 years of careful hiding, of building a life specifically designed to keep her son's existence secret from the kingdom, and the king who had rejected her so publicly. And now Miriam was suggesting she consider the very thing she had worked so hard to avoid. "You're suggesting I return to Moonfall Kingdom?" "I'm suggesting," Miriam said gently, "that you consider whether continuing to run is truly protecting Cade, or whether it might simply be delaying a confrontation that could ultimately serve him better, if handled on your own terms, while you still have some measure of control over how the truth comes to light." Elena looked toward her son, now 6 years old, strong and bright, and utterly unaware of the storm gathering around the circumstances of his birth. She thought of the tracker in the town square, of the careful questions being asked, of the growing likelihood that her son's heritage would be discovered, regardless of how far or how quickly she chose to run. "I need time to think," Elena said finally, though even as she spoke the words, she felt something shifting within her, a recognition that the peaceful anonymity she had maintained for 6 years might genuinely be approaching its end. whether she was ready to face that reality or not. Gareth moved to her side, his presence steady and reassuring despite the uncertainty hanging over the small cabin. Whatever you decide, Elena, you don't face this alone. You never have, not these past 6 years, and you won't start now. Elena looked around at the faces gathered in the small cabin, Miriam's steady concern, Gareth's fierce protective loyalty, her son's confused but trusting gaze, and she felt a fragile thread of courage begin to strengthen within her chest. Courage she would need in whatever confrontation lay ahead, whether she chose to continue running, or finally, after 6 long years, decided to face the kingdom, and the king she had left behind. The tracker's presence in the border town, she understood now with growing clarity, represented more than simply a threat to be avoided. It represented the beginning of an ending she had perhaps always known would eventually arrive, the moment when the careful secret she had guarded so fiercely would finally begin its inevitable journey toward the light. The tracker found Cade 3 days later, and there was nothing Elena could do to stop it. She had kept her son close during those tense days following the stranger's arrival, limiting his time in the town square, keeping their movements careful and deliberate. But a 6-year-old boy could not remain confined indefinitely without questions arising. And when Cade slipped away from Miriam's watchful supervision for a brief moment to chase a stray dog through the town's narrow alleys, the tracker, whose name Elena would later learn was Julian Frost, happened to be standing at exactly the wrong corner, at exactly the wrong moment. Elena arrived at the scene moments after Miriam's frantic search led her to the alley, her heart stopping entirely at the sight before her. Julian Frost knelt on one knee before her son, his expression a complex mixture of shock and dawning certainty, as he studied Cade's face, with an intensity that left no doubt about what he had recognized. "Those eyes," Julian said quietly, not looking up as Elena approached, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I would know that particular shade of gray anywhere. I've served House Ashford for over a decade." "Cade, come here," Elena said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic, and her son, sensing the tension in her voice, despite not understanding its full cause, hurried immediately to her side. Julian rose slowly to his feet, studying Elena now with the same careful, assessing attention he had directed at her son moments before. "Elena Voss," he said, and it was not a question. "I confess, I did not expect to find you here, though I suppose the pieces fit together now in ways I had not fully anticipated." "I don't know what you're talking about," Elena said, though the lie felt hollow and useless, given the way the tracker's gaze kept returning to Cade's distinctive gray eyes. "I think you understand exactly what I'm talking about." Julian's voice remained calm, professional, though there was an undercurrent of genuine surprise beneath his composed exterior. "I was sent to investigate disturbances along the kingdom's territorial bond magic, disturbances that have grown increasingly severe over the past 6 years. I did not expect my investigation to lead me to an unclaimed heir to House Ashford's bloodline." Elena pulled Cade protectively against her side, her mind racing through possible responses, possible ways to salvage the careful secrecy that had just been shattered so completely by a chance encounter in a narrow alley. "Whatever you think you've discovered, I need you to understand that my son has nothing to do with whatever political games occupy Moonfall Kingdom's throne. I'm afraid," Julian said, his tone gentle but firm, "that a bloodline connection of this significance affects far more than simple political games. The territorial instability I've been investigating, the weakening bond between the Alpha King and his Luna, these issues have grown severe enough to threaten the kingdom's fundamental stability. If your son truly carries House Ashford's bloodline, his existence, unclaimed and unbound to the kingdom's territorial magic, could well be the source of the disturbance itself." Elena felt the ground shift beneath her feet. 6 years of careful hiding, suddenly rendered meaningless by a truth she had never fully considered, that Cade's very existence, separate from any political maneuvering, might be actively destabilizing the kingdom she had fled. "What happens now?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper, fear for her son's safety overriding every other consideration. "That," Julian said carefully, "is not entirely my decision to make. My role is simply to investigate and report my findings. What the Alpha King chooses to do with this information, that responsibility falls to him alone." "You intend to tell him?" "I have sworn loyalty to House Ashford," Julian said, though something in his expression suggested he understood the weight of what such loyalty demanded in this particular situation. I cannot in good conscience withhold information this significant, not when the kingdom's stability itself may depend upon it. Elena closed her eyes briefly, feeling the careful world she had built over 6 years beginning to crumble around her. She thought of Gareth, of Miriam, of the peaceful life she had constructed in this border town, all of it suddenly threatened by a truth she had worked so desperately to keep hidden. "Please," she said finally, opening her eyes to meet Julian's steady gaze. "Whatever you report, please understand that my son is innocent in all of this. He knows nothing of his heritage, nothing of the politics surrounding his birth. Whatever consequences follow from your discovery, I ask that you consider his well-being above whatever political calculations occupy the palace." Something softened slightly in Julian's expression, a flicker of genuine sympathy beneath his professional composure. "I have served House Ashford faithfully for many years, Elena Voss, but I am not without compassion for the situation you clearly found yourself in 6 years ago. I will report what I have discovered, as my duty requires, but I will also make clear in that report that both you and your son deserve consideration and care, not simply treatment as political pawns." It was a small comfort, but Elena accepted it with the fragile gratitude of someone who understood she had few other options remaining. Julian departed shortly afterward, leaving Elena standing alone in the narrow alley with her son, the weight of 6 years of careful secrecy finally, irrevocably broken. She gathered Cade close and made her way back to the healing cottage, where Miriam and Gareth waited, with matching expressions of grim concern, once she explained what had transpired. The 3 adults spent the remainder of that day in tense discussion, weighing their limited options now that Cade's heritage had been discovered by someone with direct connections to Moonfall Kingdom's throne. "How long do you think we have?" Gareth asked, "before someone from the palace arrives to investigate further?" "I don't know," Elena admitted, exhaustion and fear pressing heavily against her chest. "Days, perhaps. Weeks at most, if the tracker's report requires careful consideration before any official response is decided." "Then we prepare," Miriam said firmly. "Whatever happens next, we face it together, with as much strength and clarity as we can gather in the time remaining." Elena spent the following days in a state of anxious waiting, watching Cade with fierce protectiveness, while trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for her son's sake, though the boy clearly sensed the tension surrounding him, despite Elena's best efforts to shield him from the full weight of what was happening. The response, when it finally arrived 8 days later, came not as a small delegation of soldiers or trackers, but as Damien Ashford himself, arriving at the border town's edge with a modest escort, his presence immediately drawing the attention of every resident in the small settlement. Elena watched from the window of the healing cottage as he dismounted his horse in the town square, his gray eyes scanning the surrounding buildings with the same intensity she remembered from the Great Hall 6 years before, though something in his expression now carried a weight and uncertainty she had never witnessed in him previously. "He's here," Miriam said quietly, standing beside Elena at the window. "I know." Elena's hands trembled slightly as she watched Damien's escort begin making careful inquiries among the gathered townspeople. "I need to face him directly, before he starts questioning others about Cade's location." "Are you certain you're ready for this?" Elena thought of 6 years of careful hiding, of the son she had raised entirely alone, of the humiliation and betrayal that had driven her from Moonfall Kingdom in the first place. She thought of Cade, currently safe in the back room of the cottage, with Gareth keeping careful watch, unaware of the storm that had just arrived, to reshape his entire understanding of who his family truly was. "I don't think readiness is really the question anymore," Elena said finally. "This confrontation is happening whether I feel prepared for it or not. The only choice I have left is how I face it." She left the cottage moments later, walking directly toward the town square where Damien stood, his escort maintaining a respectful distance as he continued his careful inquiries. He turned the moment she emerged from the cottage's doorway, and Elena watched his entire posture shift, his careful composure cracking slightly at the sight of her after 6 years of complete absence. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying across the square, with a weight that silenced the nearby conversations of curious onlookers. "I had hoped the tracker's report was mistaken. I see now that it was not." "Why are you here, Damien?" Elena kept her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil roiling beneath her calm exterior. "What exactly do you intend to do, now that you know the truth?" Damien crossed the distance between them slowly, his gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that made Elena's chest tighten, with a complicated mixture of old hurt and unexpected uncertainty about what this confrontation might ultimately mean for the fragile life she had built. "I intend," he said quietly, "to finally understand the truth I should have known 6 years ago, and to make whatever amends are possible for the mistakes I made that night in the Great Hall. But Elena, before anything else, I need to see my son." Elena's hands trembled at her sides as she stood facing Damien in the crowded town square. 6 years of careful anonymity, dissolving beneath the weight of his simple, devastating request. "You have no right to demand anything," she said, though her voice lacked the fierce conviction she wanted it to carry. "You rejected me in front of your entire kingdom, Damien. You chose my own mother over me, without a moment's hesitation. What makes you believe you deserve to simply walk into this town and claim a place in a child's life you never knew existed until 8 days ago?" Damien's expression carried none of the cold authority she remembered from the Great Hall 6 years before. Instead, something raw and uncertain moved behind his gray eyes, an emotion Elena had rarely witnessed in the powerful Alpha King during their entire relationship. "You're right to be angry, Elena. What I did that night, the way I rejected you in front of everyone, choosing political convenience over whatever genuine connection existed between us, it was wrong. I have spent 6 years slowly understanding exactly how wrong, watching a forced bond fail to provide the stability the kingdom desperately needed, watching the consequences of my choice unfold in ways I never anticipated." "And now you've discovered you have a son," Elena said, "and suddenly, 6 years of silence become worth breaking. Suddenly I'm worth acknowledging again. That's not fair. Isn't it?" Elena's voice rose slightly, years of buried pain finally finding an outlet. "You didn't come here because you missed me, Damien. You came here because a tracker discovered that my son's existence was destabilizing your kingdom's territorial magic. You came here because political necessity demanded it. Exactly the same reason you chose my mother as your Luna 6 years ago." Damien was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the weight of her accusation, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a genuine humility Elena had never heard from him previously. "You're right that the tracker's discovery brought me here. I won't pretend otherwise. But Elena, once I understood the truth, once I realized I had a son I never knew existed, the reasons for coming here shifted entirely. This isn't about political convenience anymore. This is about a child who deserves to know his father, whatever mistakes that father made 6 years ago." Elena studied his face carefully, searching for the calculating political maneuvering she had expected to find, but finding instead something that looked genuinely like remorse, like a man confronting the full weight of consequences he had never anticipated when he made his choice in the Great Hall 6 years before. "Cade is inside," she said finally, gesturing toward the healing cottage behind her. "He's 6 years old, Damien. He knows nothing about kingdoms or bloodlines or the politics that surrounded his birth. If you truly intend to be part of his life, it needs to happen slowly, carefully, without overwhelming him with truths he's not yet prepared to understand." "I understand." Damien's voice was quiet, genuine. "I'm not asking to simply claim him and disrupt everything you've built here. I'm asking for the chance to know him, at whatever pace feels right for both of you." Elena led him toward the cottage, her heart pounding with a complicated mixture of fear and cautious, fragile hope she had not expected to feel during this confrontation. Gareth met them at the door, his protective instincts immediately evident in the careful way he positioned himself between Damien and the interior of the cottage where Cade waited. "This is Gareth," Elena said, introducing the two men with careful deliberation. "He's been family to Cade and me these past 6 years, in every way that matters." Damien studied Gareth for a long moment, something complicated passing behind his gray eyes. Gratitude, perhaps, mixed with an uncomfortable awareness of everything he had missed during the years Gareth had clearly been present for instead. "Thank you," he said finally, "for protecting them both, when I failed to even know they needed protecting." Gareth's expression remained cautious, though he stepped aside to allow them entry, his eyes never fully leaving Damien as they moved into the cottage's interior. Cade sat near the hearth, engaged in some quiet game, with a set of carved wooden animals Gareth had made for him years before. He looked up as they entered, his storm-gray eyes, so clearly inherited from the man now standing frozen in the doorway, meeting Damien's gaze directly for the first time. The resemblance was undeniable, and Elena watched Damien's composure crack entirely at the sight of his son. 6 years of unknown existence suddenly made real and undeniable in the small, curious face looking back at him. "Cade," Elena said gently, kneeling down beside her son. "This is Damien. He's someone very important, someone who has traveled a long way to meet you." Cade studied the stranger with the open curiosity of childhood, unburdened by the complicated history and emotions swirling around the adults in the room. "Are you a friend of Mama's?" Damien knelt down slowly, bringing himself to Cade's eye level, and Elena watched something profound shift in his expression as he studied their son's face more closely. "I am," Damien said carefully, his voice thick with emotion he was clearly struggling to control. "I'm someone who should have known you your entire life, Cade, and I'm very sorry that circumstances kept us apart for so long." The following days passed in careful, tentative negotiation, as Elena, Damien, Gareth, and Miriam worked to determine what path forward might genuinely serve Cade's best interests, rather than simply the political necessities of Moonfall Kingdom's stability. Damien spent hours with his son, slowly building the beginnings of a relationship neither of them had known was possible just days before, while Elena watched with cautious, careful hope, unwilling to fully trust the transformation she witnessed in the man who had once rejected her so completely. "The kingdom's elders will need to acknowledge Cade as an heir," Damien explained one evening. The 3 adults gathered around Miriam's kitchen table, while Cade slept peacefully in the next room. "The territorial instability cannot be resolved without formally binding his bloodline to the kingdom's protection, whether he lives within the palace walls or continues his life here in this town." "And what does that mean for us?" Elena asked, her voice careful, guarded. "For Cade's daily life, for the choices I've made raising him these past 6 years." Damien was quiet for a moment, clearly considering his response carefully. "I won't pretend the kingdom's needs don't matter, Elena. They do, and Cade's formal acknowledgement as my heir will require certain ceremonies, certain periods of time spent within the palace walls as he grows older. But I don't intend to simply seize him from the life you've built, to force him into a world he's not prepared for, at the expense of everything you've sacrificed to protect him." "What are you proposing exactly?" "I'm proposing," Damien said carefully, "that we find a path forward together, one that honors both the kingdom's needs and Cade's well-being. Perhaps he continues living primarily here, in this town he knows as home, with visits to the palace as he grows older, and better understands his heritage. Perhaps eventually, when he's ready, he chooses for himself what role he wants to play in Moonfall Kingdom's future." Elena studied his face, searching for the political calculation she had expected, but finding instead a genuine effort to balance competing responsibilities with unexpected sensitivity to her own experiences and Cade's well-being. "And my mother," Elena said finally, the question she had avoided asking finally surfacing. "What happens to Corinne, if the bond between you two is genuinely failing, if Cade's formal acknowledgement changes the kingdom's political landscape?" Something complicated passed across Damien's expression. "The ancient laws are clear on matters of bloodline succession. A confirmed, powerful heir cannot be denied his birthright, and a Luna bond built on political convenience, rather than genuine connection, cannot continue indefinitely once that instability threatens the kingdom's fundamental stability. Your mother will need to step aside from her position as Luna, Elena, whether she wishes to or not." Elena absorbed this information slowly, surprised by the complicated mixture of vindication and unexpected sympathy she felt at the news. 6 years of anger toward her mother's ambitious choices had not fully faded, but neither had the childhood memories of a mother who had, in her own flawed way, tried to protect their family through the only means she understood. "She'll need somewhere to go," Elena said finally. "Some role within the kingdom that doesn't leave her with nothing, whatever her past mistakes." Damien studied her carefully. "That's remarkably generous, given everything she did to you. She's still my mother," Elena said simply. "Whatever mistakes she made, whatever ambition drove her choices, I don't think destroying her entirely serves anyone's interests, least of all Cade's, who deserves to know his grandmother eventually. in whatever capacity that relationship might be able to exist. The weeks that followed brought careful, gradual changes to the life Elena had built in the border town. Damien returned to Moonfall Kingdom to begin the complicated process of formally acknowledging Cade's heritage and addressing the failing bond with Corinne, while promising to return regularly to continue building his relationship with his son, at whatever pace felt appropriate. Elena remained in the border town, unwilling to fully abandon the life and community she had built over 6 difficult years, though she understood that Cade's future would eventually require some connection to the kingdom his bloodline demanded he acknowledge. Gareth remained a steady, constant presence throughout the transition, his relationship with both Elena and Cade deepening, in ways that suggested a future neither of them had quite dared to name aloud, but which both seemed to be moving toward with quiet, patient understanding. Standing in the garden behind the healing cottage one evening, watching Cade chase fireflies through the gathering dusk, while Gareth looked on with the quiet affection that had become so familiar over the years, Elena allowed herself to think back on the devastating night in the Great Hall 6 years before, the humiliation and betrayal that had driven her into a completely unknown future. She thought of the terrified young woman who had fled through the northern hills with nothing but a satchel of supplies and a secret pressed carefully beneath her ribs, uncertain whether she would survive the journey ahead, let alone build a life worth living on the other side of it. She had survived. More than survived, she had built something genuinely her own, a life filled with unexpected family and hard-won peace, a son who carried within him both his father's powerful heritage and his mother's fierce, independent strength. Whatever challenges still awaited them, as Cade's role within Moonfall Kingdom continued to unfold, whatever complicated negotiations remained between herself and Damien, between herself and her mother, Elena understood that she was facing them now, not as the humiliated, rejected woman who had fled the Great Hall 6 years before, but as someone who had proven, through 6 years of quiet determination, exactly the kind of strength that no crown or bloodline could ever fully capture or define. The fireflies rose higher into the darkening sky, and Cade's delighted laughter echoed through the garden, and Elena Voss, who had once been rejected in front of an entire kingdom, finally allowed herself to believe that the life she had built from nothing but courage and quiet resolve might genuinely be enough, not merely to survive what had happened to her, but to build something better than anything the crown had ever promised.